So, Qiana Mickie, Director at New York City Mayor's Office of Urban Agriculture. Thank you so much for joining me on the Vertical Farming Podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So, we were chatting a little bit before we got started about our mutual love for New York City. Most of the listeners will know that I grew up in Yonkers, New York. I actually was born in El Salvador, so
Mm.
I did get to enjoy a lot of the different pockets of Latino culture in the city as well.
Oh,
But
great.
yeah, I think after college, went in and lived at Upper East Side, East Village, Lower East Side, Greenpoint. So covered a couple of different boroughs. I'm wondering what life was like for you growing up in New York.
Oh, it's funny. I didn't bop around as much as you did, but a fun fact that most folks are not familiar with is I was born in Richmond,
Okay.
Virginia, but I grew up here. My mom was a New Yorker, and we moved. Since 2.5, I've been here. So I think I qualify as a New
Yeah, I
Yorker.
think you do too.
And I actually grew up in my mom's like teenage home with my grandparents. So
Mm,
while in the Bronx.
yeah.
So I'm from the East Bronx,
Okay.
but I have to rep my neighborhood, which is actually Castle Hill.
Okay. Okay. So I grew up with a love for music, house music specifically, and
Yes.
DJing. So I still got my turntables, my Technics 1200s. And so I would make periodic trips into the Bronx to get some gear or to just look through like the latest vinyl shops. And so,
Oh, that's
there's so many different parts of New York. And I think what a lot of people who think of New York City think is just like they think of just Manhattan and they
right.
forget about like the beauty that is like all the different boroughs, Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, and everyone has got its own flavor.
Yes.
And,
I was just about to say
yeah,
that.
and they've got so many different cultures. I think one of the pockets where they speak the most languages, I think was somewhere in Queens or something like
Yes.
in terms of the variety. And as you were growing up, did
Mhm.
you begin to experience that, or when did you become aware of just like the cornucopia of just like cultural experiences that New York City affords?
Yeah, it's a great question. Honestly, I grew up in the Bronx. I went to schools in the Bronx. However, my mom's friends and connections and a big part of my childhood on my weekends were actually on the Lower East
Oh,
Side. So,
nice.
being like a 70s baby,
Yeah.
80s kid growing up, where some folks felt like they didn't go to the Lower East Side or East Village or St. Mark's Place,
Yeah.
it was very much like a second home base for me. So to me, it was like, it gave me the opportunity to really be exposed to different aspects of like culture because you still had like communities that were Eastern European and like very old school, but you continue to have this influx of like artists or just folks just like making by, but bringing their cultures from different parts of the globe, different parts or even like other cities. So they became New Yorkers because they infused their culture in. And I think growing up at that time and being able to have that experience of seeing, music emerge and the mixing of culture, the vibe that people would come with in terms of like what they brought to the table, in terms of food, what they brought to the table in terms of music, and even bringing some of their reflections and traumas, it really kind of helped, I think, inform what was that unique vibrancy of New York City. And I think for me, it kind of, and especially being able to see that early on, whether it was the good, hard, beautiful, and the bad, it was like, I always kind of felt like New York was a place for everybody, but you definitely had to be open to being open. Like, how do you be aware on what you're able to bring? And are you being like intentional about what you're bringing to community? And so being able to kind of see the difference between what I was seeing in like Catholic school in the Bronx and then what I was seeing like people living, in my neighborhood in the Bronx, but also downtown, it really kind of gave me the chance to learn and see people first and like learn first before like assuming.
Yeah, I definitely like that. I went to an all boys Catholic high school in White Plains, so I can
Oh,
definitely.
wait. Should we talk about this? Which one? Because I went to St.
I went
Catherine's.
to Archbishop Stephenite in White Plains.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah. So I'm
oh, okay.
52, so I think we might have some overlap in terms of lived
Yes, we
experience.
do.
And I remember the excitement of like the birth of hip hop and just like
Yes.
buying like my first Run DMC record and just being like at these sounds that you would just like
Yes.
never heard before. And so I had a close proximity to it, like I said, because of my passion for DJing. And so it's
Yeah.
rare that people get to experience like a the birth of a wave of music or an
Yes.
experience. And so I really feel like I'm honored and that I was able to live through that because like you said, like being in New York, and I didn't get to New York as much in the 80s, maybe in the late 80s,
Right.
maybe with a fake ID, but we're not going to talk about that.
We're gonna go there.
But I would go to like after hours places like Save the Robots, like in the East Village. And so like
Yeah.
for people, New York City folks know about that. It's like you would leave the bar at like 2 or 3 a.m. and they'd be like, "Do you want to go to an after hours place?" And I'm like,
Right.
"Where?" And then just go some East Village place and down some shady set of stairs. And then you wake up and then you leave and it's like daylight. And then we'd head back up
Right.
to the upper Manhattan and get some like
Yeah.
Dominican food up in town. So
Exactly.
there's just all these unique New York City experiences. Do you have any favorites
Totally.
in terms of food?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's so funny. Like when you were mentioning that, it made me think of one of my earliest musical. Both my parents were really into music, but one of my first personal music experiences was seeing musical
Oh
youth
man.
at the
Wow, that's
Roxy
cool.
and paid for my ticket because I sold with my friends. We sold like trinkets of our
Yeah,
parents
yeah,
on like the street.
yeah.
And then like we were so cute, people like gave us money so we buy our own tickets. So it's like, but exactly like what you said, it's like to me, there's so much weaving between our music and our
Mm,
food and urban agriculture. So even years when I was still a little
yeah.
kid, I didn't really think of it, but I think what I notice is I connect a lot of my music experiences with food experiences.
Mm,
So when I think about the Lower East Side, I think about Luchesco's and, diners
yeah.
and, like all those like, grandmas like cooking or like your neighbor, giving you like lattes and,
Uh,
yeah. But, like pierogies and
Pierogies,
stuff like,
yeah.
it was like, these pockets of our culture and these like moments in our time where you were able to like have music. You also oftentimes broke bread
Yeah,
before or after.
yeah.
And so, you kind of start thinking about neighborhoods and like the smells. And I think that's something that kind of always kind of stays with me is like, thinking about certain neighborhoods and what we all kind of bring. It's interesting too, especially nowadays, like I think about how we intersect like music with our food and urban agriculture, like activities and work. I know a DJ who's actually a farmer.
Oh yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, Sunny Chiba, based out in the Bronx. So it's never too far from my heart, but I realize how deep those ties are and how much I want to bring that to, continue to bring that to New York City, but also bring to folks. But in terms of like food spots, like you definitely, I think of places like in the Bronx, like La Mirada
Mm.
and Scott, where you have the blending of like different like Asian and
The
Chinese
Chino
blends,
Latino.
Chino Latino, right? I was gonna say that, the Chino Latino, or even like yesterday, I went to the Latinera in East
Yeah,
Harlem just because I was like,
Craven.
excited that and craving that. So it's like it's nice to remember what those flavors and tastes were when I was a kid,
Yeah.
when you didn't know any better and you were eating. Like my mom used to have us eat sushi on her lunch break. She was a health inspector, so she knew all
No,
the good restaurants.
very cool.
She was a city health inspector.
Okay.
So it was interesting to, for her to kind of share that. And then, you're hungry, you don't know what you're eating, but then you start to realize as you got older, like, oh, these are all the foods of my friends and my family. These are like, and comrades. And so when you
Mhm.
get older, now being able to bring that back to folks, I think I didn't realize that until I do this work more, but I realized like that had like a real like standing. But yeah, there's some great Thai food in Queens. I
Yeah.
recently found out.
Greek food too in Astoria, right?
Oh, yeah.
So good.
It
It's
was so
I
good.
can't think of a better person to show you around and pick the best spots in town than a city health inspector.
I know, right? I know. It's so funny how like life brings you back to certain things, but
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Well,
so when you think about growing up there, your lived
mhm.
experience, you start to, you go into school, and you start to figure out what you want to study, where you envision working coming out of college. Take us a little
Yeah.
back in time. What was your mindset at? And, what were you trying to achieve or accomplish, coming out of school? And then what were you looking forward to?
Yeah. So folks tend to think like this urban ag work is something I probably went to school for. I mean, I think there are folks now, like there are classes and, curricula and, like programs that are focused on food planning, food systems, urban agriculture even. But in the 12, 13 years ago when I started in this work, none of that really existed. Or when it did, it was really more of a farm to table movement that was still very elitist and very white led and white
Yeah.
driven and very academic. So it was like folks that maybe garden themselves or new farmers because they had like second homes and they knew the importance of food and they had some relationships, but they weren't really connected in the early times to like folks on the ground who had been doing similar, grassroots work, similar, guerrilla gardening here in the five boroughs. So I would say for me, you know, so one, I didn't really know like urban agriculture and food would be my journey, even though my very first job was for the city of the Council of the
Okay.
Environment, and I was pruning and pulling out leaves. My
Getting your
first
hands in
ever
the
job,
dirt really
getting my
early.
hands in the
Okay.
dirt. Had no idea,
Yeah.
had never connected it until recently. So, initially, I always thought I was gonna work in or I wanted to work in, like, television or entertainment, marketing even, so film, television, or music. But what I realized over time, especially when I didn't get those opportunities, was what I really appreciated was not just because I have a love of, like, pop culture and music and art, but I appreciated the creative process that artists bring. And I also at the same time realized more and more that I always volunteered no matter what school I went to. So as elementary, high school, college, I always found a way to volunteer and give back to my community that I was at. So I went to school in Virginia. I used to like work with preschool students. But what it started to really make me realize, like shortly after school, was that yes, I had this passion around entertainment, but what really drove me was connecting the dots and how do people explore their creative process, whatever that creative process might be. And, I think being someone who I was a weaver and that was how I tapped into my magic and leadership
Mm.
was helping folks connect to what they knew and did well that often didn't have like a voice or didn't feel like they had the access to assets and resources. So what I would do is like I realized a lot of my volunteering was about trying to make those connections and trying to create more bridges to assets and resources to most impacted folks. And while you can do that in a creative process like entertainment, I started to find out more and more about the food and ag space. And I realized like that was something that I could also do as well in that area.
And so I know you spent some time at several organizations, and then the most
Yes.
recent one before your current was it Just Food? Without
Yes.
getting into too many of the specifics and just
Yeah.
reading off of the resume, what are some of the highlights of some of those experiences, and how do you think they prepared you for your current role?
Oh, yeah. I think it very much did. Like early on in my urban ag and food career, I started as a community advocate. I just was somebody who had a thirst for learning and a passion for action. And I think, again, because I started to see as I got older and came back from college, I also was a single mom. I started to really see the world in a different way. I started to see who had privilege and access to healthy food, different parts of the neighborhood. I think this was also a time in New York where the economic disparity started to get really obvious. So I just started to think about what are things that I could do to make a difference. Oh, so in terms of my resume, I think ultimately what I found was I've always been inspired by communities, in particular communities that are most
Mm.
impacted. And what I started to realize early in my food and ag journey was how many folks felt like including myself, didn't really understand the food and farm policy that was out there. And what I would say, like, my work really is kind of rooted in is how can I maximize my time, strengthen my voice, and collaborate and build collective power with others
Mm.
to strengthen their verse and their voice and their work. So I think initially it started as community advocacy. And I think I kind of always like lean into it, but I think more and more of my work, it really was about we understand that there are genuine structural inequities. And even though we live with it, we oftentimes don't know how to dismantle
Mm.
them. And what I started to find in the work of urban ag and food was it maybe wasn't my strength to be a grower. It maybe wasn't my strength to be a chef, But what I could do is, could I support folks and tapping in what their strengths are so they could be more aware, more engaged, more involved? And how do we bring assets to that? So, I think for a lot of reasons, like my charm, or, got me through certain conversations, or being able to make what felt like a farm bill priority be more accessible to the average person, and telling my personal story. I realized folks connected to that. And then I realized, like, there's a way to bring in folks where they're still doing the great work that they want to do. And what I could do is kind of help build those bridges, whether that's building programming, writing grants, amplifying or creating space. I mean, the reality is, as much as I've had some disparities in my life, there are also certain privileges that I have held. And, something that my mom also really taught me, and I think I've learned this growing up early on, is you can always lean into what's comfortable for you, or you can use that to leverage where other folks aren't able to show up.
Mm.
And how do you say, when you say you want to be a change maker, or you say you want to make a difference, how do you do that for yourself, but bring in other folks? How do you learn from, ancestors, or how do you learn from folks that have been doing it before? But what are you going to bring in that's going to move the needle that much forward? And I think for me, it was always rooted in impact.
Mm.
And I realized whether it was food or urban ag or gardening, what I realized was we had more folks that not being a part of the impact, or not being a part of solutions. And that was where I could bring my creativity, my thought, my capacity.
Where do you think this ability for you to empathize with folks that may not have had the opportunities you've had, or
Mhm.
communities that are underserved? You mentioned this idea of volunteering a lot, and
Yeah.
also this energy of being a change maker. If you look back, either your family life or your career life, or either other mentors, where do you think like that was developed and nurtured and grew in you?
Yeah, I think it's really a mix. I think it's a mix of seeing, either going through my lived experiences and what I found myself in. I grew up in the Bronx. We weren't wealthy, but we were, completely food insecure. But it wasn't like I didn't have family that were. And I think, that kind of helped. Again, I think having those early years, being in neighborhoods, again, following my mom, I heard jobs going from borough to borough, or, when she was hanging out, I got a chance to really see, maybe earlier than most folks, that different people were struggling and thriving in different ways. Whether that was through how they worked, whether that was through like building community power, whether that was like organizing, or whether it was just like building family. So I think my family, I think my, loved ones kind of helped influence that. But I think also having a lens to this like unique city of New York, and seeing when it worked and when it didn't. And I think being able to not be hidden from that. I think my mom was very intentional about certain things for me to see. Like, I think she wanted me to see certain neighborhoods. She would take me to certain neighborhoods to see what was great about those neighborhoods, and also what was a
Mm.
hardship. So, like, I remember really distinctly, there was a window of time, when you're in New York, it's very easy to drive through
Yeah.
from the Bronx downtown through
Yep.
Harlem, right? You can bypass it completely on our highways, or you can take the local streets and you don't stop.
Mm.
And, in the 80s, say a neighborhood like
Oh
Harlem
yeah.
was going through it. You were seeing food insecurity, you were seeing economic displacement, you were seeing, drug impacts, drug use, and just the impact that drugs brings to a neighborhood. And that was something she did not want me to be ignorant to.
Yeah.
And there were times when I would see it and we would go, or she would say, like, look at what you're seeing. This is where, not only where I don't want to see you at, but this is what can be different. And so same, so then if I go back to my neighborhood, if I go back to school, I know those folks aren't seeing the same
Yeah.
thing. They don't even talk about the same things. So, I feel like it's kind of a mix. I think with my work, I've been also afforded the opportunity to learn the history, the struggle, and the successes of urban ag leaders, land stewards, who were in those same neighborhoods that people were saying,
Right.
drive on the Bruckner and over. or drive through, bypass, don't look, don't stop.
Yeah.
Those same neighborhoods at the same time had folks that were growing, folks that couldn't leave those neighborhoods or didn't want to leave. And were in fact growing, building ways to like have food, building ways to build community, even when the systems were broken for them. And so I think growing up in being exposed to it in a realistic way, but at the same time as a way to see what else is out there, I think kind of helped inform for me that there are solutions and there are differences. So it was like, I think to me, it kind of helped establish a baseline of disparity. It helped me see things more as a spectrum than as like siloed. And I think when it comes to like food and at work, and especially even now, like I think it also helps me understand that there's a lot of value between being, like still a pragmatic
Yeah.
person. I still like to see a budget because I want people to thrive. So I think what it brings for me is like, how can I bring the visionary aspect of things or the history or the disparities, but how do we actually build feasible solutions that are relevant for multiple models, multiple communities, multiple stakeholders? I feel like that's how it kind of shows up on my work now is like when, how to be strategic about beating which drum and when,
Mhm.
but really who should be informing it and in a way that's not performative or tokenizing, but also like it should be an opportunity for folks to still get what they need, whether that's economic, whether that's housing, whether that's just respite. And I think, the work that we do here with food and ag really kind of speaks to that. And I'm hoping I can create more of that in the city.
So many good things there, and the only thing I'm worried about is how much time we have because I feel like I
Oh,
want to just
yeah. I know.
deep
I'm so
deep
sorry.
dive on all
I
these
always
topics,
forget.
and we can definitely
Yeah.
pick it up in
Oh,
person.
yeah.
Because
Hold me in.
yeah,
Hold
no,
me
that's
in. I'm
okay because
sorry.
I'm excited because we're going to meet in person because I'm going to be at Indoor Ag Tech NYC
Oh,
as well,
great.
so we can pick up some of that conversation. But I just want to take a pause to just
Yeah.
congratulate and give kudos and blessings to the people that you mentioned that really held it down for so many years, if not
Yeah.
decades, in those environments, in those conditions, who were probably like, doing it in with the toughest of odds, with zero budget, but there was something about them that felt the need to like create these urban
Yes.
gardens. And then I imagine like, some of them are probably considered pioneers in the urban ag space in terms of
Mhm.
being able to be that bridge to now these moments now where
Yes.
there are more eyes, there are more resources, but you know, God bless them for being able to hold that line,
Yes.
all this time. So I think they've done a lot of the heavy lifting, so they should be congratulated for that.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah. I will hone it in. The one thing I would say that I think is important is when we talk about urban agriculture, we talk about healthy food access in New York City, we need to remember the folks that were the vanguards
Yeah.
of doing that work out of
Mm.
necessity, out of a choice to want to heal their community, out of a choice to want their community to thrive. And not just for their own families, but for other folks. And I'm hoping that, the work that we do here it is in honor of that, but it also helps inform how do we create initiatives that help minimize climate crisis, that help minimize food shortages. But again, it's really resiliency in the neighborhood for the folks that live there.
Yeah. One thing I found interesting, you mentioned farm bills, and we always hear
Yeah.
about those things. I've heard about them growing up, and you
Yes.
immediately think of like a farm in Nebraska. And
Yes.
I don't know to what extent, and maybe you can shed a little bit of light. We don't have to go too
Yeah.
deep, but just like when
Hmm.
people think and when those are written, and the people that write them and the majority of the people who benefit from them, I don't know that a lot of people think about urban environments as it relates to
Yes.
things like a farm bill. So I'm wondering if there's a little bit of light you could shine on that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think we're in this unique window of time where we have like the farm bill policy, and oftentimes folks don't, we're farm bill season, right? And they're in negotiations. I think folks oftentimes don't think of urban agriculture as spaces that are based in our like food, like we get food out versus like what we can grow here. And I think this is a great time to kind of touch on it just in terms of agriculture should really be seen as agriculture, like the growing and production of, healthy soils, healthy food, opportunities, whether rural or urban. But I think in terms of policy, we need to use this as a window for folks to really see that also impacts where we live. Luckily, with our urban agriculture, there recently was a program in the last two farm bills that really kind of lifted the importance of urban ag in particular. So while, Farm Bill policy is, you're right, mainly folks think about, rural farmers, we have to remember we have urban growing and have had urban growing. So I'm really excited to see the innovations that will continue to be supported through the Urban Ag Innovation Program. One thing real quick, something that the office has done to kind of identify ways that folks or support how urban ag growers could connect to Farm Bill policy in a more realistic way is around urban ag is we helped inform a market bill. Well, Congressman SBI introduced the Growing's Opportunity Innovative Farming Market Bill, which is really great because what it does is say this urban ag is important. And folks that are doing urban ag, in particular, socially disadvantaged farmers and producers, should have access to Farm Bill funding as well. So it's really to kind of help find a way to spur the economic activity, the climate resiliency models that are unique to urban agriculture.
That's important to note that progress is being made on that front. And when we wrap up, I'll probably get some of these links so I could put them in the show notes if
Yes.
people want to learn more about them. So I'm
Yeah.
curious in terms of your own journey, in terms of the position you're at now. Talk a little bit about how that opportunity opened up and the conversations you had that led to your current position.
What can I share? Yes. I have a long history of working on food, agriculture, and equity. And I think as there had been an increased interest and demand for an office in New York City to really support the breadth of urban agriculture, I think it became a priority of council members and even, borough presidents. One in particular really took the lead was Borough President Adams, which is now our mayor, as well as former city council member Rafael Espinal. So I think what folks from advocates from the community side as well as business interests realized is that maybe we needed an office that could really support and identify and speak up on the interests of urban agriculture. So I think how real quick, how those intersected was I think what folks heard was, yes, we need an office that's going to prioritize this as a need, how to really advance equity in urban agriculture in New York City. And I think folks wanted somebody who had an experience in the breadth of urban agriculture, who is willing to work on the inside within an administration, but not forget the stakeholders on the outside to make those ideas a reality.
Yeah, I was there last year for Indirect Tech, and the keynote was by Mayor Adams. So it's nice to
Yes.
see, even at that level, the support for what's happening. Obviously, for urban ag, what's happening within,
Yes.
The topic of this show, vertical farming. And
Yes.
I'm wondering how those conversations have been with Mayor Adams. I would assume he's still like a staunch advocate of everything that's happening in the space.
Oh, yes. Mayor Adams is a clear advocate for healthy food access, local food procurement, especially hyper local and within our region, and that folks have that food on their plate and also are able to make the choices around healthy food that they want. I think also he continues to be an advocate on supporting the breadth of urban agriculture in our city. One thing I think folks often tend to forget that I think is important, especially in this summit, is how do those all intersect? How do we in New York City be a leader around climate resiliency, equity, food access, economic activity that doesn't leave folks behind?
Yeah.
So I think these are definitely the priorities that he has. And I'm excited to kind of talk to folks about their different approaches to it.
So that's a beautiful segue into the topic of your talk, which we're going to see at the end of this month. I believe you're talking about the topic of food security. So can you talk a little bit about how you were connected with the organization and a little preview of what's to come?
Oh, sure. So I'm going to be on the panel on the how to solve the food security puzzle. And what I'm hoping to talk about is one, that urban ag is vibrant in New York City in multiple diverse models. Also, how the city is supportive of controlled environment growing and innovation. And also learning about the impact of CEA in New York City so far. The other thing that we're going to talk about, and I'd really love to hear from other folks on the panel as well, is in the lens of defining food security, how do we do that in our perspective work? And how does the CEA sector kind of innovate through these volatile times around funding to genuinely connect to bringing culturally appropriate and relevant food to a city like New York. I think there's a lot of ways that the city can support, so I'm definitely going to come with my ears open. But I'm happy to share what some of the new and interesting things we've been doing in the Mayor's Office of Urban Agriculture.
I'm excited for that panel. It's going to be really a really good one.
Thank you.
Your topic is covering food security, but I also want to delve a little bit into this idea of food justice because I think it's a term not many people have heard much about, and I feel like they go hand in hand with food security. So I'm wondering if you could talk a
Yes.
little bit about what that means for you.
No, great question. Oftentimes people talk about food security, and one of the main goals of the food security movement is to end hunger. So, what I'm hoping we get into on the panel is how can the sector of ag tech address meeting this goal of ending hunger? But when we talk about food security, it doesn't necessarily equate to food justice. And food justice is really about the right to grow, sell, harvest the food that community wants and decides on. So, what I'm curious to also hear is when we talk about food justice, how are we increasing opportunities for communities, in particular impacted communities, to be a part of the solution of addressing food scarcity in their communities? Are they able to be business owners in these models? Are they able to not just grow and not just grow for profit, but can they grow to feed like what is a really hard approach, which is nutritional food, but also, food that will help us minimize like the hunger gap?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I got to see this firsthand, obviously in my time in New York
Mhm.
City, but recently at Indoor AgCon, I think the
Yes.
team at Green Side Up took us on downtown Las Vegas, the not glamorous part, and
Oh,
but
interesting.
you got to see like food deserts, and we got to visit a couple. It was two buses, and we went to a couple of like these
Yeah.
in-city grocery markets that anyone who's
Mhm.
lived in the city is very familiar with, like Purple Sun Kissed in the front row, and then like
Mm.
produce sections that are all pretty much empty, and so.
Yep.
Thankfully, it's been nice to see some new innovations happening there with a previous guest with a company called Harvest. They've actually installed 5 container farms inside the space. They're
Oh,
almost to
wow.
start producing. So
That's
I think
great.
this idea of food deserts, and it's almost like out of sight, out of mind sometimes. If you're not aware, you take it for granted that you can
Yes.
walk into a Whole Foods and you have all this fresh produce, and
Yes.
that's not the case for everyone. And I'm glad to see initiatives like this happening to just increase awareness to what's happening in all
Yes.
these communities. I think it's really important.
No, totally. Oftentimes folks in urban ag and food spaces, we talk about the distance between supermarkets or access models. But what is missed often in the definition of food desert is the access to hyperly local grown food and who's growing that food. So, I think what really comes up for me and part of what I'm really interested in, innovating here in the city is how do we continue to support hyper local grown production of healthy food and what are the different models that can do that right in our neighborhood. So we're minimizing maybe historical redlining or or disconnects between where folks were able to start a business, like what's relevant to us now. And I think that's also something, the city is looking at and other agencies too, is how do we really support hyperlocal production, hyperlocal distribution in a way that, we can also create opportunities for indoor because there's a lot of great, opportunities that could still be climate resilient, but still meet a food security need or, dismantling food insecurity.
Yeah.
So we're minimizing those disconnects, but we're doing it in a way that is relevant for the community.
Very important topics, and I'm again looking forward to that discussion. It's hopefully going to be a lively one,
I know. I hope
yeah.
so.
I'm curious what your experience has been with specifically indoor farming, controlled
Yeah,
environment agriculture, because obviously that's been rooftop gardens that have been started in Brooklyn as well. I'm
sure.
familiar with. I'm curious what your experience as you've begun to become more aware of the
Yes.
opportunities that exist for year-round growing.
Yes. One of the things that's going to always be important in addressing, either achieving food justice or food security is like year round production of healthy food. So I continue to try to learn from and identify partners that are doing that well in New York City, whether it's at a really big scale like Gotham Greens, at retail, Or again, are these opportunities for, BIPOC folks or, little income folks to get able to be in like the model, like growing mushrooms. I mean,
Yeah.
growing mushrooms for community consumption, growing mushrooms for retail.
Yeah.
So I would say like I continue to kind of be informed by the gamut, but also trying to learn like what are their unique needs as partners, as models, as folks that might be new to business, as folks that are proven businesses. What can our city assets do to really advance urban agriculture in those ways?
Yeah, and showing that these models exist for smaller entrepreneurs who are
Yes.
just getting into this idea of
Hmm.
farming, but it's not how we all would think about, like, if you're going to be a farmer, you got to be on a
Exactly.
farm. And now,
Right.
because of what you can do and even the yields you can produce, you can literally have a
Absolutely.
container farm that could supply, a lot of
Yes.
locations. And I think having help, especially with the business models and
Mhm.
and the offtake agreements, and being sure that people can not only grow, which a lot of these companies can help them with, but you have the crop now. Do you have someone that's willing to buy
Yes.
it? Is there a need for that, and helping them make those decisions? Because a lot of times, first-time business owners
Yes.
struggle with these, and that's where you see a lot of the failures if they don't have that proper planning and that proper support.
Oh, totally. It's interesting. You bring up two things that are really big initiatives in the Office of Urban Ag is one, identifying where is the supportive resources, trainings, materials, in particular around food and urban ag that we could provide to New York businesses, in particular small businesses and folks that are even MWB eligible. How do we get folks that typically don't see themselves as business owners to genuinely connect and get to the point where they're able to do that at a viable point? I think the other thing that you're touching on is the need to see different models and entry points in order to have that business. So I know for me, one of the things I'm continuing to like learn is like we oftentimes think about rooftop farms in these really big ways. And folks are still really interested in what they could do in their average New York, rooftop,
Yeah.
whether it's their windowsill or whether it's like their
Yeah.
building. So I also want to create just more materials and awareness so folks feel clear on what we do know about rooftop gardening is just one example, from folks that have done it really well and have long-standing
Yeah.
practices. But how can that be lessons, best practices or lessons learned that we can then share with folks that might have a slightly smaller
Yeah.
rooftop and how to make it viable? But again, it's great to have sweat equity based community ag work in any community. But the reality is, folks still need economic opportunities. So, how do we can support that?
Yeah, and I think anything you can do to have someone have this feeling of being self-sustainable, I think is really
Yes.
powerful. And it's challenging in the city. I've had a taste of it just being out here. I'm now in Minnesota, and we have a well, so we've access to fresh water. But it's
Yep.
these things that people who grew up here probably take for granted, and people who live in the city. I was in New York City for Hurricane Sandy, and for the average
Mhm.
listener, we lost power for a couple of days,
Yep.
and even up at power for a week, and then running water, I think, for a day or two. And there's
Mhm.
nothing that shocks you into like the importance of having access to water and
Yes.
food as an event like that. And so I think it was, and the same way COVID, right? And at
Oh, yes,
much greater
totally.
extent, and so anything that gives people this sovereignty and agency over their choices, or at least to have some backup plan if they want. It's not going to be anything that's going to be fully sustainable for weeks, but I think all these little initiatives help people feel a bit more secure about their relationship to food.
I totally agree. And it's interesting that you bring up sovereignty too, because I think that's like, again, like as I kind of see it as a spectrum. So if we're, establishing a way to address food security on the road to creating food justice, where we're creating more opportunities for more folks, how do we now actually continue to try to strive for sovereignty where there's, as much opportunity and especially the lens of like climate crisis? You really can't talk about urban agriculture and we really can't talk about food production without that lens. Mitigating climate crisis, but also how do we recover? And I think that was also something we saw when we hit food shortages or when we hit like power shortages, how critical our resources like electricity, how critical our food chains are. And the closer we are to our food, the closer we are to conserving or saving or utilizing energy well. it will help us like not just survive, but thrive. But if we're not thinking about climate crisis with ag tech and urban ag, then we're really missing the way to make any of this viable and sustainable.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to having those conversations at the summit too.
You may have people not letting you leave the conference that are going to have something to come. They're going to want a few minutes of your time.
That's fine. I'm here for the
Yeah.
people.
This is a question I like to ask. It probably changes day by day, but what's a tough question you've had to ask yourself lately?
All right. That's a good question. One of the hardest questions I continue to ask myself is, am I continuing to remain grounded while being visionary about the work that I'm doing to advance urban agriculture and equity so it impacts not just some New Yorkers, but it really has a beneficial impact for all New Yorkers?
That's a good thing to keep in mind, I'm sure. Hopefully it doesn't keep you up at night. But that's a lot related to that question. So I just want to thank you for your time. And as we get close to wrapping, I'm really excited that this was able to get scheduled. And it was
Yes.
nice to connect with a fellow New Yorker. I'll consider myself a New Yorker forever, so that's not going to
Yes.
change. And so, given the audience, I talk to a lot of CEOs and founders of vertical farming companies from around the world now. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of, you mentioned Gotham Greens, and thankfully I was honored to have Vera on the show as well.
Oh, great.
But that audience is some of the folks who listen. So what I've been
Mhm.
doing is leaving a little bit of room at the end of these conversations as a platform for you. Is there a message when you think about the growing ag tech industry, vertical farming, and maybe as
Mhm.
it relates to urban environments, but is there a message or anything you'd like to say to those folks?
I would say one of the things that I continue to look forward to and look to the ag tech community is to continue to find ways to be innovative in not just production, but building intrinsic value to the work.
Hmm,
And how do they continue to bring food, healthy models, economic opportunities to our diverse communities of New York City? So I'm always keeping my eye out on what is being innovative in their landscape, but also how do they bring that back to the city?
that's something that folks are going to be happy to hear. So thanks for including that. So again,
No, thank you.
yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're a very busy person and you've got a lot on your plate, pun intended. But I look
I love a
forward
good fun.
to meeting you in person and attending that session. Where's the best place for folks to connect with you outside of the conference?
Oh, yes. I always encourage folks to find me on the office official social
Okay.
media. We are at NYC Urban Ag.
Okay.
We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Okay. Thank you so much again for your time. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you, Harry. Appreciate it.